Hello, my lovelies! I'm Ginny O, the author with no last name, and I'm also a dev editor, fashion designer, and game dev, and I like to talk about branding a lot. It's not something I see many other channels talking about, and it's something I'm familiar with as a fashion designer and indie author. So, you want to make a medieval MMORPG. Don't. I'm going to say the quiet part out loud and rain on your parade. There are 3 ways to hook an audience for any game brand. An interesting new world to run about in, an intriguing new storyline, and fun new game mechanics people haven't seen before. Medieval MMORPG products have currently none of these things. And I want to address this in one video rather than doing 101 medieval fantasy MMORPG videos because the projects are either scams or they come and go so quickly there's next to no point. Don't make a medieval MMORPG. It won't work. Do something else. Anything else. You still might fail. People will at least remember you better than, oh, another person who tried to make a medieval fantasy MMO and didn't succeed. So, why do medieval MMORPG projects fail? They don't know what their game is actually about, and they're pitching a genre, not a story. How many times have we heard, I want to make RuneScape, World of Warcraft, Guild Wars, EverQuest, or your favorite fantasy medieval MMORPG here, but better! As if this was a complete and entire pitch from story to game mechanics, and when you ask for more detail, instead of giving you story or anything exciting, they give you a list of mechanics basic to the MMORPG genre of games. Class system, mounts, PvP, crafting, housing. Usually they try to pitch it to you as a PvP only or a sandbox game where you can do anything, hyping up the game mechanics they find most exciting in the games they already love to play. When you press for more, they don't have it, because they really don't know what their game is about. They have a genre, not an actual game with a goal and conflict and structure. Well, PvP-only sandbox games don't need goals or conflicts or structures. I beg to differ. If you want your nice PvP-only sandbox game to survive, you need to have an overall conflict that encourages both competition and cooperation and enough balance in your game the high-level players can't gank the low-level players and ruin the fun. So many of these PvP sandbox games have figured out how to reward competition, and at the same time have left the cooperation aspect completely to the players and have no reward systems in place for players to work together. So guess what the players do 9 times out of 10? Then the games die because no new players come in to give the game life, and the developers wonder why no one is playing their awesome game. Sorry, your hardcore whale players ruined it for everyone else. This, I want to make RuneScape but better, or whatever their favorite fantasy MMORPG, is really just the first step to their overall game pitch. They haven't analyzed what worked about these MMORPGs in order for them to make them better in the first place. They haven't taken that hard look at player statistics to know the ratios of PvE to PvP players and where most players spend their time in the game. Make World of Warcraft but better is doomed to fail because, well, World of Warcraft still exists. If that's the sole extent of your pitch, it's time to take your pitch up a notch and put some creative skin into the game and come up with your own idea because there's a glut on the market. All these medieval MMOs that are successful, and even the ones that are not, still exist to be played. If I want to try RuneScape, I can play it for free off of Steam. As you can see, I can install Guild Wars from my old codes and play it. Guild Wars 2 is free to play to a certain level. You can buy World of Warcraft and play that, and they even have classic servers. The basic game of Black Desert Online is $10. It is very hard to compete with a $10 basic MMO game unless you're free to play. There are new games out on the market that are medieval fantasy MMORPGs going at varying levels of success. Crowfall, Blast, Mortal Online 2, Albion Online, Defense of the Ancients 2, and these are some of the ones with servers still up. Those with servers going or gone include Life is Feudal, Titan Reach, Rift, Fiesta, Arcage. Those that are coming include Ashes of Creations. Those that were scams like Dreamworld, Oath, and Chronicles of Illyria. And I'm sure there are those I'm missing, but there are 19 medieval fantasy MMORPGs I've mentioned off the top of my head, ranging from 4 of the top 5 popular MMOs to those that are dying and those that are scams. Plus, Elder Scrolls Online makes 20 fantasy MMORPGs without thinking too hard, and 4 of those are part of the top 5 with Final Fantasy XIV, which is a Japanese fantasy MMORPG versus a more classic medieval fantasy, but it could technically be part of this list. The more games there are out in the medieval fantasy MMORPG market, the more your game has to compete with all of them to stand out. And let's face it, most of the time, they won't. There's no point of difference, and people are bored. Many of these games are already out, look, and play almost exactly the same. It's a matter of finding the game with the most content and graphic style you enjoy and playing it into the ground. If you like realistic graphics, you may vary between Elder Scrolls, Guild Wars 2, or Black Desert. Final Fantasy edges on realistic, but with a lot more fantasy-inspired races. RuneScape is low poly. World of Warcraft is cartoony. Try Crowfall for another cartoony MMO. Be a centaur. But they all have the same type of systems. PvE, PvEP, crafting, housing, you get a quest, you go out and kill a bunch of monsters and get the rewards. And the new MMORPGs like Ashes of Creation and New World are exactly the same. And if you screenshot of these MMOs side by side and look at the clothes and the buildings and the character types, they're all going to look the same almost no matter the graphic style. People have tried to remake World of Warcraft with the newer, higher resolution and more realistic graphics, only to find that while people think it is cool, doing a World of Warcraft 2 in that style is just boring, and there's no demand for it. People have already seen it. No matter the graphic style it is in, the medieval fantasy trappings were set by EverQuest and World of Warcraft, and other games have done the same thing in a realistic way, so why bother? Yawn, no demand. You may think there is demand. If you look at the way these newer games are going, the demand is clearly not there in the market. We live and die by numbers, folks. Going into the village and pre-sailing Ascalon induces a heady feeling of nostalgia in MMO players. Which is funny to me all the time, because I know in like 3 hours that village is going to be rubble. We have seen this type of medieval fantasy when Neverwinter Nights came out in 1991, amplified by EverQuest in 1999, and taking the world in World of Warcraft in 2004. It's old. It's tired. People may be nostalgic, but they aren't eager to see it again. Because once again, they can go back and play most of those games and get that feeling. Yes, I know Ashes of Creation is trying. I wish them every success. There are 3 reasons for the lack of point of difference. The combat classes and mechanics are indistinguishable from each other and are a hodgepodge of different time period armor and fashion that from a historian's perspective makes no sense. There is a view that success breeds success, and the character classes of D&D and EverQuest and World of Warcraft will breed more success if you make games in the medieval fantasy setting with the exact same classes because people know these classes and love these classes. And it doesn't matter if it is action combat or target combat, there is still a general sameness about how these classes work and work together because you don't mess with what works. They call it the Holy Trinity for a reason. I mean, this is the entire premise behind Ashes of Creation. And let's give, say, Crowfall and Black Desert Online credit here, and Guild Wars 2 to a smaller extent, for pushing the boundaries and types of character classes you can play. Black Desert Online does this by including classes from more Chinese wuxias, historical type of MMOs, while Guild Wars has a more Renaissance feel to it at times and has a gunslinger, while Crowfall went the full extra mile and included centaurs, which you would hope would have a different playstyle than a bipedal class no matter if it's a deer or elf or minotaur. Whether or not it does is up for debate, but they tried. Again, these studios take notice of what other studios do, and if they see a Lich type of class doing well in one game, they'll copy it for their game. If they see an oversized armor is popular, they'll add it to their game. When Guild Wars Factions came out, it was one of the first games in the West to include Eastern-style classes. Other games took notice and added them. And from a fashion and historical perspective, you've got everything going from the Romans and Vikings to later medieval full plate armor and everything in between, and it's a bit of a mess because in your fantasy world, unlike the real world, we're supposed to believe those all coexist at the same time. The only reason we do is because movies are also really bad about doing their historical research. In the West, we are so used to seeing different time periods and centuries mixed in these so-called historical dramas, we don't even bat an eye about it in our fantasy. So, when you try to make a RuneScape a better type of game, you're starting off with this exact style D&D type of character class and fantasy armor and medieval builds types of prints, and we've seen it repeatedly. Where does the but better come in? And when I say medieval style buildings, even though that should encompass everything from the 900s to the 1500s, what I usually mean is the mud and wattle buildings of the time of Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth I. The ones you see everywhere at asset stores. So many of these game assets look bought from an asset store, even if they aren't. Scrolling through the Unity and Unreal asset stores, most of your building assets and modules are going to be medieval fantasy inspired because game makers have fallen into this trap of going, fantasy sells, make medieval fantasy, and game devs who are buying these assets will prove them right by buying them. So the game asset makers make more of these types of assets until you can't find anything else. Which means if you're a game asset maker and have someone who wants another time period and you're willing to make that time period, you won't be out of work for a while. There is, in my opinion, a rather unfair bias against game devs buying assets from these stores. Yes, there are game devs out there using these assets to make games like Dreamworld and turn around quick games with very little content to make money. At the same time, not everyone who wants to make games has the ability, money, or time to learn every single program and be a one-person machine studio doing everything that it would take anywhere from 6 to 50 people to do for other games. So it's okay if people buy these assets. That's the entire purpose of them. What's not okay is when these big AAA games and tiny indie games all look exactly the same, because it starts putting a great deal of unfair pressure on small indie studios that don't have the resources of AAA studios to make a AAA quality game. And well, again, from a branding standpoint, means your game isn't going to stand out. So, if someone uses an asset pack to start an MMORPG and suddenly changes it to an NFT Bitcoin scam, then that asset pack suddenly gets a bad reputation even if the other game makers aren't remotely affiliated with the person who basically ripped the demo videos for these asset packs to promote their scam. Or Mirandis, I think, using stuff from Cinti Studios, who as a studio has a lot of great low poly medieval art. I mean, they need to make some animals. I mean, they've got characters and dungeons and buildings and particle effects, and it's really not great for them if someone uses their asset packs to create a scam. There are too many scams to keep track of right now. And then we have the matter of details. Story being ripped off from other medieval fantasy MMORPGs. D&D, Arthurian Legend, the sanitized English version and not the Welsh version, Tolkien, or any of your other supposedly evergreen white male fantasy authors. Look, here's a D&D game in the works. Lord of the Rings Online exists. Okay, that's 23. RuneScape has the market cornered on Arthurian-style story, though I'm not sure, is it the English romanticized version of the later Middle Ages, or the fun Welsh anti-Anglo-Saxon versions? Look, I am Anglo-Saxon partly. I can make fun of my people here. Stop stealing from the Welsh! Especially for love triangles, and affairs, and castles, and round tables that didn't exist. As an author, I know story writing is difficult. I mean, I have my own mixed-up fairy tales type of adult genre stories here, where in the first book, the Sleeping Beauty helps a French beauty keep her daughter from becoming a Rapunzel before going off to deal with a bunch of werewolves. The second book is Sleeping Beauty only halfway played straight. Doing medieval fantasy is a very low-level entrance point with readers and game players. We know the coding. We know what castle and knight and the basic angelicalized German and Norse mythology with a dash of Roman Greek understanding of how magic looks like and how it all works together. Sort of. We know why dragons tend to be bad. We get dwarves like Ale, and well, elves are supposed to be flighty. And centaurs really depend on those stargazing versions or the come and steal your women versions. And people are tired of the same recycled stories. They want new things, but not too new of things. So if you want to do medieval fantasy, you need to find a new thing that's not too new of a thing. And most authors don't know how to do that because they love the old thing way too much to let it go. Unfortunately, in games, unlike books such as Game of Thrones, medieval fantasy is not evergreen. Oh, right, Game of Thrones has a completely terrible game. It exists. Unless you have a huge franchise with a great deal of sales and popular culture pushed behind it like Dungeons & Dragons, your game, if it is medieval fantasy and takes part of those standard tropes, it's dead in the water story-wise. Look, even Wizards 101 had the same type of tropes. Right now, I'm not going to touch a new medieval fantasy MMO unless it's Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar MMORPG. I'd actually probably play it as long as I could be a herald or one of the mage people who loves birds, or a griffin. If I could play a griffin or one of the actual bird people or the lizards, bonus points! Otherwise, I own Guild Wars, and I am happy playing it if I need a combat MMO game. And a large reason why these lack of point of difference failures exist is primarily lack of research into medieval life or sticking solely to the time of Queen Elizabeth I. And a huge failure of these games is they are basing themselves on other medieval fantasy games instead of doing the primary research into medieval times and choosing something within those over 600 years and sticking to it. There was a lot of time between the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the bubonic plague that ended feudalism. And it's not all based around England all the time. I think the old cartoon Hysteria did a short about Poor Poland, which is actually on YouTube as a brief history of Poland, which did a very short version of how many times Poland, Europe's breadbasket, has been invaded since its founding, which is a lot. Something to do with the king not actually being able to keep a standing army, and they would hire them out of other royal families in Europe and not give him any power, so eventually they'd leave in disgust. Of course, All the royal families in Europe are related one way or another, which eventually resulted in World War I centuries later. The Habsburg monarchy started in 1282 and went to 1918, which started with Germany acquiring Austria and later the Netherlands, and eventually having a branch line on the throne in Spain. And during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had anything from 1 to 7 popes and 3 different major cities where the pope lived. And while there was a lot to choose from between folklore, legends, and the original, not-so-sanitized fairy tales, England is the tip of a very large iceberg. If you think the War of the Roses is complicated, it was just a small part of the 100 Years' War, and the overall conflict was not any better, which can at least get you to jump the channel to France. The whole concept of courtly love started in Europe and moved to England, which had them absconding with the Welsh tales of Arthur and changing them to fit the courtly love narrative. Anyways, my point is there are a lot of fascinating type of true stories tucked away in the history to base your story on, and as you learn about history, you learn about the development of a castle evolved over time, as did the fashion and the armor. And if you don't love this type of research and find this era fascinating, then you're making the wrong game. Even doing proper research and choosing a different building style that also comes from the period and narrowing down your armor and weapon styles may not be enough of a difference to make you stand out in the crowded marketplace. Because I don't know about many other MMO players, but I don't even want to see a medieval weapon right now. I don't really care how great your sword building system is or how flexible and customizable. It's too late. Unless you're licensed to a big name property, it's time to move on from the medieval fantasy MMORPG. It's dead. The market is full. It's time to excite people with a different time period or a different culture. And the Chinese market for historical Han Dynasty style Wuxia games is also filled. So 1600s onwards, 800s and backwards, Roman, Greek, Africa, Turks, South America, anything around the American Revolution, Regency period, Victorian, which is a huge swatch itself due her 50 years plus reign, Edwardian, American West, sci-fi is an underserved market. They're not a huge one and hard to break out if you don't have an original IP. Try Solarpunk, cooperative survival MMOs, social life crafting skill MMOs without combat, or super optional combat. Take 2 or 3 of these and make something up. I will take an awesome, weird Western based on the aliens and disappearances of the American West from the superstitions in the Arizona, Roswell, New Mexico, and as far as north as the Utah Skinwalker Ranch. There are amazing stories waiting to be tapped from Paranormal Witness, The Dead Files, and Missing 411. Any further north than that, you're hitting Yeti/Dogman territory, and any southeast is the Skunk Ape. Though, do your research thoroughly. Native Americans don't talk about skinwalkers for a reason. They don't want to draw them to them. Same with the Wendigo. On the other hand, portals to other planets/the stars, great aliens, lizard aliens, nature spirits, creepy and cool. If you want to be a success, you need to know what your game is about more than a list of genre MMO mechanics ripped off from other games. Your game needs to not be part of the glutted marketplace of medieval fantasy MMOs with combat classes, mechanics, assets, and a story that look and sound exactly the same as everyone else's. There's no point of difference. Do your research from primary sources and trustworthy secondary sources, and work out a game you can be passionate about that isn't RuneScape, but better. When the medieval fantasy MMORPG genre has had time to rest, and many of the games go offline, then maybe there will be time to make a revival. That time is not now. The declining market and the way these games are coming and going so fast and can't keep a long-term player base proves it. We're 20 years in, folks. The breakout successes are things like Valheim with Vikings, and 1700's Greedfall, and a desire for a really cool cyberpunk game that Cyberpunk 2077 didn't quite meet. And Star Citizen is still trying to be that successful sci-fi MMO. Medieval fantasy MMORPGs are the past. We need, as game developers, to look forward and figure out what is next. Or else MMORPGs might fade away completely, even if there are more people interested in playing them more than ever before. They'll all play Final Fantasy XIV or the like. And if you do have a medieval fantasy MMORPG idea, I wish you all the success and luck in the world. You are going to need it. Thank you for listening. Bless, stay safe, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.